is Professor Henry
Wallach, professor of economics at Yale University. Professor Wallach has been in this country since 1937, and I really don't think there's any purpose to be served by going into his academic credentials, where he went to graduate school and so forth. He is a very well-known economist, and I suppose I would say in general follows in the tradition of political economy, is very much interested in economic policy. I think of Henry largely in terms of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and in particular international financial policy. But this evening he is going to speak on resources and whether or not we are running out of resources and the implications of zero economic growth. He is an individual who is very well qualified to speak on these matters. He has served with the Federal Reserve System. He has been a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, one of the 3 presidential appointments to the Council of Economic Advisors under President Eisenhower. He is currently a consultant to the Treasury and has written, of course, a great many books and articles in the field of economic policy. May I present Professor Wallach?
Thank you very much, Dudley, for a concise introduction. Like the principal speaker, I think the chairman, too, should be brief, clear, and seated. We've started here with absolute punctuality, and that certainly is one step forward. Whenever I see a group of people come to listen to a speaker after dinner, I feel that they're really interested in the subject, and so they deserve a punctual beginning. Now here I'm going to talk about are we going to run out of resources in a series that seems to be devoted mostly to topics related to poverty. And it may not seem that this is a very direct relationship. Actually, it is. If we run out of resources, or if, in a broader context, growth has to be stopped because we run out of clear water, clean air, or because we run out of food, one of the many reasons why the environmentalists say that growth has to be stopped, we will have a very direct confrontation with poverty. To slow down, let alone stop the rate of growth, means to freeze the presently poor into their poverty. And before they accept that, I think some very drastic action will be taken. Not long ago, in my hometown of New Haven, we had a hearing on whether the local power company should be allowed to string some wires across the Quinnipiac River. And the company was being criticized by various groups of environmentalists who complained about the damage to the view, some other environmental damage connected with the plant that was being built, and a variety of sophisticated concerns. Then there appeared the alderman of the so-called hill section of New Haven, not one of the better sections, a black, and he said, "You can string those wires any way you please, above ground, underground, underwater, suit yourselves. But my people don't want it to cost 1 penny more than it could be done cheapest. And we don't want power to cost 1 penny more than the cheapest you can make it." And that very clearly shows the nature of the confrontation that will arise. The poor want cheap power, they want rising incomes, they want general betterment. And the people who've got it made would like to have the wires strung underground where it's more expensive, but it will, of course, improve the view. Now, this debate between the environmentalists and the poor has not come upon us suddenly. It's the outgrowth of a long discussion of economic growth, which didn't even begin with Jack Kennedy's saying, "Let's get America moving again." Concern about economic growth was felt long before. But the glorification of growth as an economic objective, I guess, is characteristic of the Kennedy era. Growth was going to solve all our problems. And growth indeed has the makings of all kinds of solutions, because growth means more resources. When the economy is growing, you've got income, GNP, money, in other words, to do things with. You can raise the incomes of the poor, you can improve their living conditions, and what some people don't always consider, you've got a justification for the existing state of affairs. Growth is a justification for maintaining inequality of income. In other words, for maintaining a state of poverty. Because growth will eventually lift the poor out of their poverty. It gives them hope. If you had to end growth, that hope would disappear, those means would disappear, and then we confront poverty at its starkest. What then are we going to do? At that point, we might decide to redistribute massively. We might take from the rich and give to the poor, but the tax rates that would involve will give you pause. And when you consider the position of the United States in the world, and when you consider that the American poor, half of whom own automobiles, most of whom have TV, many of whom have homes, certainly most of whom have telephones, how they compare to the poor in India, how our $4,000 poor compare to the $400 a year poor families of India, then it becomes apparent that our poor will have to contribute to improving the lot of the poor abroad if we want a fair redistribution internationally. I don't see the present administration in Washington or any other that might succeed it passing that kind of legislation, and I don't see, frankly, the people obeying the legislation if somebody were bold enough to pass it. That, in short, is what the debate about continuing or discontinuing economic growth is about. I said we did not get into this problem all of a sudden. It had the makings of the previous interest in growth, had the makings also of a build-up to disappointment. Here we grew more rapidly than ever before, and what has it done for us? It's left everybody at everybody else's throat. The country is torn asunder, people are angry, dissatisfied, and poverty is still with us. The anti-growth feeling, the disappointment, has gained strength from a new spirit of anti-materialism on the part of many young people. Seeing the results of affluence, they don't want to have to do with it. They would like to see us get on with other matters. And some of you may be surprised to know that this is not a new idea. Some 50 years ago, John Maynard Keynes, who revolutionized economics, said that he thought within 100 years we would have reached the point where we could ignore economic problems, where the problems of scarcity would have been solved, and we could devote ourselves to what he called matters of the mind. He said this sometime during the 20s, so he figured apparently that this period of bliss would descend upon us around 2020. Meanwhile, we've had 50 years of growth, and there's little evidence of a swing toward matters of the mind. There is still poverty, there is as much dissension as there was then, and there is the same degree of perplexity. This suggests that the problem we have is a deep one, and it isn't going to go away easily. That was not the view of the experts when environmentalism first surfaced. This was perhaps 2 years ago that the media began to pick it up. And I recall the editor of a very distinguished weekly who commissioned a whole issue to be written about this, because it was the most important matter before the nation, and we had to get it out. It really was an absolute deadline. And I said, if it's so important, doesn't have a little time to be researched? He said, get it out, get it out. I said, how long do you think the public's going to be interested in this? He said, about 6 months. Well, for once, a very astute editor misjudged his public, I think. The issue is still here. It won't go away. If you look back over economics, you'll see that parts of the debate really are a very old issue, namely those parts that have to do with resources. There are other parts. There are parts that have to do with air and water pollution, that have to do with crowding, with space, that have to do with energy supplies. Those are a little more modern. But the basic problem of food was first presented by the Reverend Robert Malthus in 1812, who came to the conclusion that population would outrun food and starvation would ensue. It was not a good prediction, although it was elegant economics, because he juxtaposed an arithmetic rate of growth, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, with a geometric rate of growth, 1, 2, 4, 8, and by showing that population grew geometrically and food, as he put it, grew only arithmetically, he arrived at his shattering conclusion. Well, it was probably the second worst prediction in economics. The worst prediction, I think, was Karl Marx's prediction that the workers would be impoverished by capitalism. But Malthus' prediction that we'd all starve so far runs that one a close second. Because what happened was a tremendous explosion of food output and a condition in which in most parts of the world you have adequate, if not very good, supplies of food, and in the United States you have food coming out of our ears. Now, a similar line of reasoning was pursued by other leading classical economists, And it's interesting that their debates and conflicts are still relevant today. Malthus thought in terms of some absolute limitation on food. You couldn't produce more than this little bit extra each year. One of his successors, David Ricardo, had a more sophisticated scheme. He said, in effect, you can have as much food as you want, but each successive unit is going to cost you a little more. You've got to produce on less and less fertile land. You've got to apply more and more capital and labor to the same land in order to get the same increment in food. In this way, you get the Malthusian kind of shortage, the absolute one, and the Ricardian type of shortage, the relative one, where shortage is a phenomenon at the margin, it's a phenomenon of costs. Since that time, there have, of course, been many surveys of the food situation and the general resource situation. From time to time, there have been conservationist scares, standing room only on this planet. Are we going to starve? The technicians seem to have sided with Ricardo and not with Malthus. It seems that not only food, but resources in general, that is, mineral resources, energy resources, are basically a matter of cost rather than of absolute limitation. In the last analysis, you can wring resources from a piece of rock. You've just got to employ enough energy to break it down. It's not an efficient procedure. We don't use it. We don't have to. But essentially, the volume of resources of all kinds contained in 1 cubic mile of granite rock, just ordinary rock that constitutes the surface of the globe, is tremendous, and it runs into the many hundreds of thousands of tons of aluminum, of copper, of lead, lesser amounts of silver and gold. The world is made of resources. The great problem is, how do you develop the technology to get them out? Well, this is the broad overall situation in which our discipline found itself before the latest wave of assaults. These assaults come from a group of systems technicians at MIT, principally Forrester and Dennis Meadows. These are not economists, these are not research experts, they're computer experts, and in their way they have had a tremendous impact. Forrester, a man who did a great deal to advance computer technology itself, now used the computer to construct what he calls a world model. And he puts this model through its paces, and the consequences of population growth, of resource consumption, and all the other things that go on is always terrifying. We come up against some dead wall where in some way civilization collapses from lack of resources, from pollution, from overcrowding, from starvation. His disciple Meadows has done a similar thing, and more explicitly in a book called The Limits to Growth. Been a tremendous success. In it, he shows you diagrams produced by his computer that always show broadly the same results. 80 years from now, 100 years from now, 120 years from now, civilization collapses. It may collapse because food doesn't keep up with population. It may collapse because we run out of natural resources. It may collapse if neither of those two things happen from pollution. But collapse is always inevitable, except on one condition. That one condition is that we stop economic growth almost immediately. Now, as I said, Forrester and Meadows aren't economists. Economists have sort of gotten a lean on economic growth, and they've been much disturbed by these arguments. They've been particularly disturbed by the way in which the press took them up. Whether you read Anthony Lewis in the New York Times or Claire Sterling in the Washington Post, they all believed this. There's a mysterious group called the Club of Rome, which financed the study of Meadows and which has done the publicity on this book, and they've indeed done it very well. They've gotten widespread acceptance. So I suppose the first thing to do is to say a few words from an economist's point of view about Forrester and Meadows. Here are two extremely able people who have violated all the rules of scientific procedure. You get a scientist who has a bright new idea. There's an accepted way of going about it. He works it out. He then discusses it with a group of his peers. He presents it at professional meetings. It gets criticized and checked, and they probe into it. And if it survives, then it is taken to the public. Well, now what happened here? This finding, such as it was taken immediately into the public domain, into the press, without prior checking, and in a way that amounts to the same thing as if a drug company, let's say, were to take a new antibiotic directly out of the laboratory and into mass distribution. The Food and Drug Administration wouldn't allow that, and yet in our field that seems entirely possible. A large number of people have arisen to criticize the procedures of Forrester and Meadows, and this debate is sure to be with us for a long time. There is evidence that they have not only skirted the proper procedures, but also have not done what scientists would do, namely base what they feed into the computer on quantitative empirical data. Here comes all this stuff out of the computer, and you think that it must have some factual basis. It does not. These are simply the assumptions of Meadows with respect to, let us say, how much the level of air pollution is going to rise if the GNP rises to some particular level. Then he would say, suppose I'm wrong, suppose the level of pollution only rises half as much. Well, anyone familiar with exponential growth will know that it then takes only 20 years longer to nevertheless reach the same level of pollution, so you're in the same fix 20 years later. And he repeats that kind of procedure, seeming to yield to his critics, but always arriving at the same result a few decades thereafter. The result is really preordained if you match limited resources, however large, against an exponential series. The exponential series always wins. There's a thing called doubling time at something that grows at 1% per year will double in 72 years. If it grows at 2%, it doubles in 36, and so on. So inevitably, ultimately, there can be standing room only, and there can be disaster only if these propositions are correct. Now, on that issue, the scientists will surely have a great deal to say. What is relevant from the point of view of people concerned with poverty are the policy implications and policy recommendations that are drawn directly from these studies. They are that we must quickly terminate economic growth. They recognize that this is not easy to do, but they do not go into what would be the distributional implications or the technological implications. They simply conclude that civilization is faced with disaster unless this is done. Now, against that kind of approach, a large mass of evidence can be levied, and it's this evidence that I would like to review with you tonight before I come to some more positive suggestions. There is a great deal of evidence about the behavior of our resources in the face of rising demands. After all, the things that Meadows and Forrester are saying could have been said 20, 50 years ago. They were said in a way by Malthus 150 years ago. And if Malthus' prediction was wrong, then why shouldn't Meadows and Forrester's prediction be wrong? There are certain tests of resource adequacy and the past behavior of resources that one can apply. And while these rest on past behavior, as all empirical tests must do, nevertheless they give you some suggestions for the future. Let me go over these tests quickly. One is to examine the rate of growth of per capita consumption of resources of all kinds, in this case food resources and energy resources and mineral non-energy resources. They've been rising in per capita use, but very gradually over a long period of time. Over 100 years in the United States, the use of all resources has been rising at something like 0.7% per capita per year. You compare this with the rate of growth of GNP, which has been in the range of 3%, you'll see that it's a rather modest fraction of the rate of growth of GNP in total. And if you take the rate of growth of GNP per capita, which has been around 2%, you'll see it's still only 1/3 of that rate of growth. What would you expect if resource use grows at 0.7% per capita and GNP at 2%? You would say that the demand for resources does not keep up with GNP, and that actually, unless there is a strong limitation on the supply of these resources, the price of resources should be going down. Well, that's precisely the complaint of the developing countries that they've been making since the war, that the demand for the products they export, raw materials of all kinds usually, is inelastic with respect to income. That has been blocked to their development. This thesis is associated with an Argentine economist by name of Prebisch. It's been preached in the UNCTAD meeting of the United Nations. Developing countries are handicapped by the slow growth in the demand for their products. This is the contrary of the argument of Meadows and Forrester that we're going to run out. And so far, it seems very clear in the behavior of the exports of those countries and in the behavior of the prices for those exports that Prebisch was right and not the other side. There's a second test of resource behavior, and that is the productivity of labor in producing resources. If we were in a Ricardian situation where it gets harder and harder to wring the next unit of resources from a recalcitrant universe, then presumably it would take more and more labor per unit of resources to produce. Actually, productivity in the production of resources has been rising. It takes less and less labor per unit of output of resources as the years go by. In the United States, productivity gains of labor in the production of resources have actually been almost as fast as productivity gains in general. This suggests that there is no particular barrier to the production of natural resources. Another test, compare the prices of natural resources with the price of goods in general. There's some price index. It turns out that the relationship is roughly constant, with some declines since World War II. There's one interesting exception. Forest products have been rising in price. Everybody who's looked at the price of lumber over the years knows that. And here we find also that the productivity of labor has been lagging. You get less lumber per unit of labor as time goes on. There are further tests one could make, but I think the point is clear. So far as one can tell from the past behavior, resource output, resource prices, productivity, there's been no particular obstacle to the increase in the supply of these resources. If you turn to particular resource areas, you get a rather similar picture. Take food, which might be considered the most critical. Now, in the United States, as you know, we restrict the production of food because we'd be producing too much and the price to the farmer would collapse if we did not impose production controls and price supports. It has been figured that if the farmer were given a price level equal to 100% of parity, we could produce twice the food output that we're producing now within a period of perhaps 10 years. We could double output over 10 years. It's also been computed that if we went all out, not only paying high prices, but also bringing inferior land into cultivation, we could feed a population of 500 to 800 million people, as contrasted with our present population of a little over 200 million. If our population went beyond that, we would have to back away from the eating of meat, and people would have to eat cereals. We went to a all cereal diet. We might be able to feed as many as 3 billion people out of the agricultural resources of this country. So food seems to be no problem in the U.S., certainly. The rest of the world, the picture is a little different, but it is never completely Malthusian. There have been periods and areas of malnutrition, but world population is rising at a dramatic rate. Food has not been a constraint on the growth of population. And in one way or another, food output has always managed to keep a jump ahead of the needs of the local population. We cannot be sure that it will always be so. In fact, one is compelled to assume that someday this continuing green revolution will come to a stop. But there's no evidence at present that it will. Let's take a look at another area, that of energy. Energy has the interesting characteristic that it rises at almost exactly the same rate as the GNP. If GNP since the war has risen at 4%, energy inputs into the economy of all kinds, coal, petroleum, electric power from hydro sources, natural gas, have risen on average at 3.5% per year. Now here you get into the higher numbers. 3.5% per year mounts up rapidly. If you look at electric power by itself, which rises at 7.7% per year, that doubles in less than 10 years. So here one is moving at a rate of expansion that needs to be watched very carefully. But even so, it is computed that our present coal, oil, and oil shale resources are sufficient to last us for 1,000 years at our present rate of consumption. Now this rate of consumption, of course, increases, but taking a projected rate of consumption such as it'll be in the year 2000, we'd have enough for perhaps 150 to 200 years. So again, no immediate catastrophe here. Looking at our supplies of uranium, assuming that we develop the technology that is already more or less in hand of breeder reactors, we can turn U-238 into plutonium, which is fissionable, and have an amount of energy available equal to about twice all the other energy sources that have existed in this country. Now, that again covers us for some time ahead. If we should make a real technological breakthrough to a fusion process, which so far is not in hand, although some things are known about how it might be done, we would have an almost limitless source of energy. A volume of seawater equal to 20 cubic miles contains enough energy resources to equal all other energy sources available in the world today. Now 20 cubic miles is not a very significant share of even a moderate-sized body of water, so the supply really seems to be limitless. What is more menacing is the pollution aspect of energy uses at these high levels. All energy ultimately degenerates into heat, and heat can't be recycled, unlike other resources. And we face, therefore, the possibility of heat pollution. This seems to be hundreds of years into the future. But since some of the things I've been arguing, namely that you can ultimately draw resources out of rock, imply very heavy energy use, it is incumbent on one to examine what are the environmental consequences of very high energy use. All one can say is that nobody really knows. People talk about a rise in world temperature through heat pollution, melting of the ice caps, and all sorts of unpleasant consequences. But the melting of the ice caps also means that water heats up, and that means more moisture in the air and more clouds. Now, clouds have the effect of shutting out the radiation of the sun and keeping the earth cool. So scientists divide into two schools, those that predict melting of the ice caps and we'll all drown. The others predict a new ice age and we'll all freeze. As an economist, I conclude that one cannot do business with those types for the time being, and I assume that for a long time to come we will suffer neither of those two calamities. Well, I've tried to give you a rundown of the resources that are available, and I've taken a frankly optimistic position of our prospects. Now, of course, I could be wrong, and suppose the other side were completely right, that resources are really much harder to develop, and they will indeed become increasingly scarce, so that within some foreseeable period we face calamity. Should we then, on the chance that that may be true, stop economic growth? Or should we go ahead in the hope that it isn't true and take a terrible chance? I submit that this is probably the most important decision that mankind will have to make, short of the decision to build the atom bomb. That was the biggest, because we can blow ourselves up. But to stop growth is surely the second biggest. And it is a decision that economists will tell you doesn't really have to be made. You can construct a mechanism that will make it for you if it's necessary. This mechanism is familiar to all economists. It's called the price system. You have to allow the evolving shortage of resources to make itself felt through rising prices, and if the cost of resource scarcity and the cost of pollution, the cost of diminishing land availability, food availability, if all that is allowed to express itself in the price system, it will have an interesting result. It will mean that it no longer will pay to invest money in order to grow. Capital will become unproductive because of the high costs of everything. At that point, then, investment will slow down. The return to capital will be very low and zero. Nobody can gain from investment. And when investment becomes zero, then with some qualifications, growth also comes to an end. But nobody has made a decision about that process. It's an automatic process that's brought about by the price system. It's something that has been known to economists for a long time, that under certain conditions the market system tends toward a so-called stationary state. Stationary state is a condition in which growth has come to an end. Our problem as economists, then, is to see whether we can build a system in which the price system has these effects. As you look at the price system working today, you will see that it suffers from a number of defects that prevent it from fully doing its job. A great many of the consequences of economic growth do not fully come out in prices. Somebody builds a plant and pours gook into the river. He pollutes, but he doesn't have to pay for the consequences. So he goes on doing that unless he's stopped in some way. Someone else builds a plant that has a chimney that emits smoke, and he pollutes the air. And again, the same consequence happens. So long as we have these so-called externalities, adverse effects that the party causing them doesn't have to pay for, we don't get the proper reaction on the part of the polluter to what he does. You've got to make him feel the consequences of his action. This can be done much better by a tax system than by prohibition. Today there is a tendency to try to prohibit pollution by regulation. These devices typically are destined to fail. If they are successful, they usually turn out to work very expensively because you've got to apply the same rules to everybody across the board. Consider the opposite technique through a system of internalization. You measure as best you can the pollution created by a plant, a municipality, whatever, and you put a tax on it. You make this tax so high that except in extreme cases, the party would rather desist and shift to some other production process, build a sewage plant, deal with the consequences of his action other than by paying the tax. In that case, you can establish any level of pollution, residual pollution, that you wish if you make the tax high enough. This proposal often arouses outcries on the part of environmentalists because they say that's a license to pollute. Well, of course, exactly, that's what it is. And if you make the license expensive enough, you'll get very little pollution. An economist would tell you you can go one step further. Instead of imposing a flat tax on such and such volume of effluents, it would be possible to auction off the licenses to pollute. That sounds particularly antisocial. It is not. It just means that you use the price system and achieve the desirable minimum level of pollution at minimum cost in terms of the readjustments that the productive machinery has to make. So the economic techniques are available for this. Now you can apply a similar technique from the point of view of resource costs, but there the market really does much of the job by itself. If copper is getting scarce, what would you expect to happen? If this is correctly foreseen and observed, people will not get copper, dig it out of the ground and sell it at the same price. They will hoard it, and the price will rise all the more in the present. Now, hoarding again sounds bad, and so people will say that's antisocial. Not at all. It's a wise procedure to save for the future a resource that is becoming expensive today. And more, the way to deal with the copper shortage, of course, is not only to stash copper away for the future, it's to find substitutes. And the way to induce a search for substitutes is to get the price up so that it pays to employ research and development, that it pays to bring in aluminum and pre-stressed concrete and whatever else can be used in lieu of copper. The price system will tell you how to proceed with resource use. It will tell you what resource to use, how to replace one resource by another. Experience shows that technology is very flexible. During 2 world wars, Germany was cut off from the rest of the world and had to make do with the mineral and other resources they had. They found it very easy to find substitutes for the things that became scarce, including techniques of recycling. The same would happen if we allow the price system to go to work. Now, the price system, of course, isn't perfect. You cannot be completely sure that the price of copper today will reflect a prospective shortage 20 or 50 years from now. But by and large, the price system has worked pretty well. And for that reason, it is reassuring that the prices of raw materials haven't gone up. There seems to say that firms that are well informed do not anticipate on the basis of their studies a forthcoming shortage of these minerals. There is a similar mechanism at work with respect to land. Land, too, rises in price as it becomes more scarce. Now, that sets in motion reactions among people that tend to offset the problems of land scarcity. In this country, there obviously is no shortage of land as such. Urban land takes up about 2% of the surface of the United States. What we do have is a crowding into particular parts of the country that makes life there very unpleasant. and we ought to have either employed policies or allow the natural mechanism to work to prevent this crowding. The fact that the mechanism hasn't worked properly may be due to faulty policies. For instance, we have encouraged the movement of farmers to the city by the kind of agricultural price support policy that we have employed. We could have designed our policy more intelligently. We've also allowed the concentration of population in cities to produce conditions that kept the people there. Certainly the blacks can't move out of the cities, so that again the rise of rents, say in New York City, does not have the expected effect of driving people out of New York City. The mechanism is not perfect. It may need some help through governmental policy, but the basis for its functioning is there. Let me mention one means of coping with future shortages that I think is the wrong one in practically every dilemma. It's zero population growth. In the US, zero population growth has gotten a great ploy, and it's really useless to argue about it because essentially we've already reached it. We're now at a net reproduction rate of 2.11 or less per female, which means that over the years, not immediately, the population will stabilize and level off at something like 300-odd million sometime early in the next century. These projections are always extremely uncertain. They vary within a decade by tremendous amounts, and it isn't worth pursuing it. I just want to stress population growth as such is not the source of the problem, and stopping population growth would not stop our resource problems. On the contrary, if we were able, let us say, to stabilize the population right now, what would happen is an increase in the rate of per capita growth. The amount of savings made by the economy and the investment made possible by those savings would be applied to a smaller labor force, so that for each worker there would be more investment, more machinery, more tools. His productivity would rise faster, and per capita output would rise more rapidly than it does today. Aggregate growth would slow somewhat, but not sufficiently to make much of a difference. You can argue the same with respect to urban crowding. Population growth is not the cause, but the movement of people. In the last census of our 3,000-odd counties, some 2,000 were losing population. Now, despite the rapid rise in population, it's movement, it's not numbers that does this. If we want to curb urban crowding, we've got to deal with movement, we've got to deal with motivation, where people want to live, not with the numbers. But the fact is that the numbers are already beginning to stabilize, so that this is, in a way, water over the dam. Let me now look at the opposite situation of a model in which you have a slowing of growth through the working of the price system. Let us suppose that a deliberate political decision is made to stop economic growth, such as Meadows and Forrester propose. What are the most likely implications? I find it hard to conceive of a situation of zero growth with the present unequal income distribution. Rich and poor seems tolerable, as I said before, if everybody is rising. If everybody is frozen into his present level, the continuation of rich and poor is intolerable. So we have to redistribute. How you do this politically is virtually inconceivable. But it leaves this question: if ultimately we might let the price mechanism work in such a way as to bring growth to a halt, if that were to be the result, wouldn't we also have to get greater equality? The answer is yes, we'd get it automatically without government decree. If it turns out that resources are plentiful, then the price mechanism will never stop us. We'll go on growing. When resources cease to be plentiful, the price mechanism will bring growth to a gradual halt. Now, the reason that happens is, as I said, investment becomes unprofitable, the rate of return on capital goes to zero, and investment ceases. But when the rate of return on capital goes to zero, means that the people who own capital cease to receive an income. And the greatest source of economic inequality will have disappeared. The ownership of property, with the exception of land, will have ceased to convey an economic advantage when the rate of return becomes zero. The ownership of land is something else. That would have to be dealt with differently, because land is scarce permanently, and you could not expect its return to go to zero. But for the rest, the principal source of inequality of income would have disappeared, so that the model of the stationary state gives you an answer to the problem of how to end inequality also. What the model does not tell us is how to solve the problem of the developing countries. There, a very ugly situation is developing. A conference was held at Stockholm recently in which views clashed very severely. Luminaries like Paul Ehrlich of Zero Population Growth were there, and they were more or less shouted down. The developing countries said, your claim that growth must slow down and that population growth in particular must be controlled is just another imperialistic trick. We're going to increase our populations, and we're going to create a situation of tension in which you will find it in your own interest to give us more aid and help us develop. The Brazilians and the Nigerians made that point rather bluntly, that pollution and population growth are going to be the instruments of pressure. Well, we face a very difficult situation there, because the mechanism that has slowed population growth in the U.S. has not yet had its full effect there. The mechanism that has slowed and finally terminated population growth in the U.S. is the familiar one that you start with high birth rates and high death rates. You then develop means of lowering the death rate through better health practices. That brings the population explosion. Then after a while, the birth rate also declines, and you reach equilibrium at low death rates and low birth rates. The developing countries are in the midst of that explosion. Medicine has helped them reduce the death rate. The birth rate is coming down slowly, but not fast enough. Hence the explosion, and it's not clear when the birth rate will have declined to a level where their population will level off. It is difficult to think that if that process is to go on for another 100 years and we get into something like 30 billion people, that we should not have trouble. it's conceivable along the lines that I've argued that our resources will stand up. Technology may be developed to make it possible. But this, I think, is by far the most sensitive spot, the population development of the underdeveloping countries, and for that, as yet, we have no obvious answer. For our own country, I think one can say that we are in reasonably good shape and that the concerns of Meadows and others are misplaced. What we have to do is fairly clear. We've got to put the price system in such shape that it will act as a brake on growth if and when a situation of excessive pollution or shortages of food or of resources or of energy is coming about. If it doesn't come about, the brakes will never bite. If it does, the brakes will bite and will slow to a halt in a condition in which also the income distribution is a great deal more even. So the job to be done from this point of view is simply to fix the brakes, internalize the externalities that polluters are generating, make sure that the price of resources reflects their true scarcity, encourage research and development that will lead to substitutions of scarce resources. And if we do all that, which is not measured by the magnitude of the problem I've described, a very difficult job, I think we can look at the future with a good deal of confidence without fear of the Meadows-Forrester consequences. Thank you very much. Be glad to answer any questions if I can. Well, any questions? Well, you put your finger on a very good point. The oil depletion allowance works both ways. It encourages a search for oil, which is good in terms of resources. It also encourages maximum present use, which is bad. Now, the worst of all worlds is to have the oil depletion allowance and keep saying that we're going to remove it, because that compels the companies to hurry up and get the oil out of the ground. So the first thing would be to either decide we're not going to have it, or we're going to have it and leave it there. In the resource sense, clearly, it is preferable to remove it and to allow oil reserves to build up, provided you are reasonably sure one thing, of which I have no firm knowledge. If there were to be an alternative source of energy developed, say some fusion process or very plentiful energy from fission, it might turn out that we'll never have occasion to get all the oil out of the ground. Now, coal is very probably in that condition. We will go to fission energy and fusion energy long before we've dug up all the coal, so that this